Sometimes I wonder, not merely about waking alone in a room, but about opening my eyes to an entire world emptied of breath, of voice, of witness. Not in the quiet stillness of a familiar flat, but in a universe abandoned mid-sentence, where existence itself had sighed once and fallen silent. The first thing I noticed was not fear. It was silence. A silence so absolute, so fathomless, it seemed almost sentient, as though the world itself had paused to listen. A single pale thread of sunlight slipped between the broken slats of the blinds, stretching languidly across the wooden floor, a thin, trembling finger pointing towards absence. The dust motes spun lazily within it, each one an echo of movement now long forgotten. Barefoot, I stepped onto the warm asphalt outside. The street still cradled the last exhalation of the dawn. There were no sounds, no rumble of distant engines, no murmur of human voices slipping from open windows, no bark of a restless dog echoing across courtyards. The city was not destroyed. It was deserted, not ravaged by fire or flood, but left behind, a hollow shell abandoned by its beating heart. It had forgotten how to speak its own name. I wandered its empty veins, past the glassy eyes of shops and offices. And in every pane of glass, windows, car mirrors, polished doors, it was only ever my own reflection that met me. Over and over again, a silent interrogation. Who are you? Without an audience. I felt untethered, a ghost adrift in a diorama of life as it once was. Nothing burned. Nothing bled. Nothing screamed. Everything was untouched, and yet utterly, irretrievably changed. I sought connection in vain. The radio yielded only static, hissing like an open wound. The telephone was a cold, inert object. No missed calls. No frantic messages. No desperate news bulletins. Not even a single goodbye. It wasn't an apocalypse I was surviving. It was the echo that followed. The world had not ended in fire or fury. It had simply paused, suspended between two heartbeats, and somehow I remained. The silence was not benign. It had weight. It pressed against my skin with the tangible density of a storm building on the horizon. The world around me was whole, but hollow, a cathedral of absence. Even time seemed to thicken, flowing around me like slow, golden syrup. Inside an abandoned underground carriage, my breath misted the windows, and my fingertips tingled with the thickening air. I could feel the seconds piling atop one another, heavy and sticky, smothering motion, suffocating thought. Stillness reigned, profound and unsettling. I wandered into a supermarket where automatic doors, stubbornly cheerful, still chirped open at my approach. Lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows down immaculate aisles brimming with untouched abundance. It was a kingdom of excess, untouched by hunger. A grotesque monument to needs that no longer existed. And then, a scent. Sharp, sweet, sickening. A banana, softening into rot, its skin splitting to reveal the rapid collapse of matter into memory. The cloying perfume of decay sliced through the sterile air like a blade. That scent, more than the silence, more than the emptiness, anchored me to reality. Civilization wasn't simply missing. It was spoiling. Life was not preserved. It was eroding. I picked up a mango, warm from the lingering sun, and bit into its radiant flesh. Juice ran down my chin, too alive, too vivid for a world that had surrendered to stillness. And at that moment, I understood. This was no dream. This was mine. To endure, or to dismantle. I was not the last person. I was the first. The first to inherit a world that had moved on. At first, the absence of rules felt exhilarating. I stormed through luxury penthouses, slid across marble floors, wore clothes I would never have dared even touch before. I drove a scarlet sports car through the city center, weaving between blinking stoplights still dutifully trying to enforce order upon a lawless emptiness. Music blared from speakers, orchestral, then rock, then hip-hop, until even static roared against the silence. I screamed into the wind, my voice breaking apart like foam on a cliff. In glittering hotel lobbies, I ate cake with my bare hands. I swam naked in aquarium tanks, drifting among fish whose glassy eyes didn't recognize the absence of mankind. I ruled a kingdom made of air and dust. And it was intoxicating, until it wasn't. By the third day, I began talking aloud. Not to myself, exactly, but to the empty world around me. I named the pigeons that watched me with their sharp, city-wise stares. I dressed mannequins in expensive suits and sat them opposite me at tables, pouring cold coffee into chipped mugs. I held court with ghosts made of cloth and plastic, just to hear a voice, even if it was only my own echo bouncing back. Inside the Natural History Museum, I stood beneath the colossal skeleton of a whale, tracing the ridges of its ancient ribs with trembling fingers. The bones hummed faintly against my skin, vibrating with a resonance older than memory. The whale had once crossed vast oceans. Now it hung, lifeless, a question suspended in silence. Was this my fate too? Movement ossified into memory? Life distilled into relic? The city decayed in silence. Buildings exhaled. Sidewalks buckled as trees clawed their way free. Mold unfurled like a second atmosphere inside sealed rooms. In a ruined flat, mushrooms blossomed from a cracked piano. I pressed one yellowed key, and a soft flurry of spores danced in a shaft of sunlight, remembering the shape of music. Soft destruction moved with the grace of neglect. I tried to outrun it, retreating to a cabin beyond the city's brittle edges. But knowledge weighed heavily upon me. I remembered 400 nuclear power plants, ticking away without caretakers, their safety protocols slowly dissolving into irrelevance. I began to draw borders in my mind, entire regions that were no longer safe, no longer clean, no longer mine to wander. One night, lightning struck the edge of a dry forest. I watched fire unfurl through the trees like a living, malevolent thought. No sirens screamed. No water cannons fought it. Only me, running, the heat licking at my back. Civilization had left behind bones and dangers. Now, both belonged to me. Injury became existential. Every twisted ankle, every cut from rusted metal, every fever brought the specter of death closer. Hospitals were now silent mausoleums. Doctors, myths. I became a cartographer of my own body, mapping every bruise, every heartbeat, every tremor with a desperate reverence. I scavenged abandoned pharmacies, built a fortress of bandages and antibiotics, taught myself to stitch wounds with shaking hands, practicing on scraps of leather until my fingers bled. Water became sacred. I learned to coax moisture from the air, to purify stream water with fire and prayer. Every drop, every swallow, was a triumph against oblivion. I respected the cold when it came. It crept beneath the doors, slipped between the seams of my layered clothing, bit into my bones. I burned furniture. I wrapped my hands in rags. I feared sleep, not for the dreams, but for the possibility I would never wake again. I looked into mirrors and barely recognized the reflection staring back. A creature carved from hunger and loneliness, hollow-eyed, sharp-edged, feral. And always, that whispering question behind my ribs. What am I surviving for? Even survival, stripped of purpose, began to feel hollow. Lonely. Mechanical. Without others, my existence felt like an echo trapped in a cathedral emptied of believers. I stopped speaking aloud, not because there was no one to hear me, but because even my own voice began to feel foreign, like the memory of someone who had vanished along with the rest of the world. Instead, I listened. I listened to the world learning how to forget itself. The slow, mournful creak of floorboards under my feet. The languid drip of rain against the rusting tin roof. The distant groan of metal as skeletal buildings sagged deeper into decay. These sounds became my companions. Ghosts in the vast, breathing silence. I started leaving messages behind, though I knew no one would ever read them. Fragments, scrawled on the backs of receipts, scratched into the bark of ancient trees, inked hastily onto pages torn from forgotten books. Not stories. Not diaries. Not even letters. Just proof. I was here. A desperate archaeology of the present. A breadcrumb trail for no one. A refusal to go quietly into the dust. I imagined myself from a distance, a lone figure wandering through the skeletal remains of civilization, building small altars of memory from plastic bags and rusted torches, carving questions into the marrow of the world. Sometimes I laughed at the absurdity of it all. The sound was brittle, fragile. It died quickly in the open air. And then, one day, I found a dog. Or perhaps it found me. It appeared at the threshold of the cabin. Rain-soaked, shivering, eyes sharp yet wary. We stared at one another for a long moment, two survivors of a shipwreck marooned on the opposite ends of a barren shore. I opened the door wider. It stepped inside. I fed it, spoke to it, named it, though the name meant little in a world where words had lost their anchors. It never spoke back, of course, but it listened. Or perhaps I only needed to believe it listened. At night, it curled at my feet as I read aloud to the crackling fire. Fairy tales, epics, dusty novels about cities and families and lost loves. I didn't read to remember the world. I read to remember what I was missing. I passed the remains of a school one day, desks overturned, blackboards cracked and gray with dust, children's drawings peeling from the walls. I sat at a child's desk, so absurdly small beneath my grown frame, and closed my eyes. I tried to hear it. The hum of whispered conversations, the shuffle of books, the burst of laughter that once ricocheted off these now crumbling walls. When had someone last looked at me, really seen me, not through a screen or a hurried glance, but with the full, heavy gaze of shared existence? The absence of others wasn't just a silence of sound. It was the silence of perspective. Without witnesses, I had become a house of mirrors with no reflections. At times, wild thoughts took root. I imagined freeing the animals from the city zoo, building a fractured, impossible community among lions and parrots and elephants. But reality intruded. Not all would wish to be friends. Not all would understand. Some hungers are ancient, older than love. In the end, I returned to the dog. He was enough. More than enough. Yet some nights, lying in a bed that once belonged to a stranger, I'd whisper names into the darkness. Names of those I loved, names of those I had wronged, names of those I had never had the chance to say goodbye to. Their ghosts filled the hollow spaces between my words. When the wind rattled the windows just so, it almost sounded like footsteps approaching. One morning, before the first light unfurled across the ruins, I climbed to the top of a cliff overlooking what had once been a city. The skyline was a jagged silhouette against a bruised and brooding sky, vines swallowing broken glass, ivy curling over crumbling stone. A wild garden reclaiming the bones of ambition. As the sun finally rose, slow, hesitant, golden, it lit the wreckage not with cruelty, but with a soft, forgiving grace. The earth was healing. Perhaps it always had been. Perhaps it was us it had been healing from. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of time stretching back and back and back. I remembered how starlight travels for years, centuries, millennia before it touches the eye. The night sky is not a map of what is. It is a tapestry of ghosts. Each glittering point a farewell whispered across the void. And I wondered, if someone, somewhere, someday, gazed back at Earth from a far-off star, what light would they see? Would they understand the signals we had left behind? The satellites still circling like stubborn memories, the golden record adrift in the endless black, the crumbling books and silent bones? Would they know we had laughed? That we had loved? That we had tried? In the quiet that followed, I noticed the small, sacred miracles. The hum of bees threading through the cracks in abandoned walls. The way dust dances in a shaft of sunlight like tiny, lost galaxies. The delicate, defiant bloom of lichen on forgotten stones. I no longer feared death. Not because I had conquered it, but because I had made peace with its twin, absence. What I feared now was something deeper, more profound. That we might never have truly existed without each other. That life was not an act of isolated survival, but a chorus. And I was singing alone, a solitary voice echoing in the ruins, hoping, yearning, for an answer. So I began to build. Not a monument to be worshipped. Not a message to be deciphered. Just something. Something unmistakably human. A garden, stitched into the cracked earth with stubborn seeds. A trail of stones painted in garish, joyful colors. A wind chime fashioned from broken glass and bent spoons, rattling unevenly in the shifting winds. Not to be remembered. Not to be found. But to mark the fact that I had lived. To leave a question carved into the skin of the earth. Who stood here once, and dared to hope? Perhaps that is all we ever truly do. Not endure. Not conquer. But leave behind traces, smudges of beauty, fragments of thought, footprints across a forest floor no one else will ever walk. I sat beside the wind chime as dusk fell, listening to its ragged, imperfect music carried into the emptiness. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't grand. But it was enough.